here. They gave me the opportunity to speak last year at this conference and invited me back, so that means either they couldn't find people or I did something right. I'm going to go with the later, though. So what I'm going to do for this talk is something that has never been done in the history of tech. So we're all going to bear with the best. I'm going to make a 50-minute talk about PCI. It's interesting. So I'll try my best. If it's not interesting, you can throw things at me. But the impetus for writing this talk is I work at a company called Hurricane Labs in Cleveland that does a lot of work with clients that need work with Splunk. And Splunk is the tool that collects their logs. And a lot of times I see Splunk as the checkbox for maintaining logs for compliance purposes. And we get questions about compliance that I have to answer. And I found that I'm running into all these concerns about compliance, and I really didn't completely understand, and I still don't completely understand because it's compliance, but I tried to better understand what my clients are asking questions about, because it's obviously important if they're trusting us to maintain their logs for the sake of being compliant. And I wanted to see what actually compliance means. Why are people trying to do different things with the compliance scope that they're looking to maintain security on? And it's like, I really need to dig into this. So that's what I did. I did research with Steve McMaster, one of my coworkers, and myself. We reached out to clients who are subject to PCI compliance. We reached out to auditors and QSAs to understand, hey, what are these sorts of things that when you're going through an audit, what runs through someone's mind? And what parts of the standards are important? How are they interpreted? And is there a way that compliance can be interpreted so that we end up with a state where everyone's happy? You pass the audit, but you also maintain a state of security. Because in the compliance standards, they only say so much. They tell you what you're supposed to do, but every auditor or QSA who's reviewing the compliance standards is going to be interpreting those a little bit different. And we found that, is there a way that we could make this more consistent so that we result in a state of being secure, but also compliant, and make it so that, when you are subject to an audit or going through your environment with your QSA, we don't want it to be a nightmare, because that stinks for everyone. So just to get started here, how many of you are subject to some sort of compliance requirement? I would assume that's going to be most everyone in this room. Perfect. I was actually going to hand out drink holders for that, because you clearly need a drink as a result of being subject to compliance, but I left them in my car in Ohio, so I apologize. So that's a fail on my part. How many of you are auditors or QSAs? A couple of you. Normally I would have everyone glare at you guys and stand up, but we won't do that for this. But for everyone, sorry. But why we're here. Really, the idea of this is, how do we win at compliance? How do we treat compliance as a lifestyle? All too often what I see is treated as a big project. You have a project manager assigned to the PCI audit, and they're responsible for making sure that everything's compliant for that period of time. A year goes by after you get your compliance checkbox, and then all of a sudden, it's the same thing over and over again. It's this never-ending cycle of, we got to get compliant, we got to pass our audit, we forget about it for a while, and then it happens again. But we want to make it a lifestyle. Just like certain products, they try to make their brand a lifestyle. PCI or whatever other form of compliance should be your lifestyle. And as security professionals, that's really what our goal is. So we want to concern yourself with overall security. How do we understand what the standard is asking us to do, and then not focus on a specific audit as a individual point in time assessment? So I'm going to say that, yes, I'm focusing on PCI just because that's what I found was most standard across our clients. So most of these are going to be based on the PCI DSS. However, these concepts can be applied to whatever type of compliance standard that you're looking at. And really the concept I want to share is compliance by default and compliance by design. a state where you design your environment so that it is compliant, so that regardless of what individual auditor or QSA shows up to look at your environment, there's a way to understand what you're trying to achieve, and also to be able to be in a state where you know you're secure and you know you're meeting the standards without having to worry about, maybe someone interpreting the standard a little bit different than what you would expect. And really, the main concept I want to address throughout this presentation, the ongoing theme, is the idea of the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. The letter of the law being exactly what the standard says. And we're going to dive into the different parts of the PCI standard, and I pulled out a number of different bullet points from it so that I can highlight the differences between, what exactly the standard says, and then how, as security professionals, we should interpret this and be able to defend our decisions when we're being assessed. And a good auditor will be able to understand those distinctions. They'll understand that, the standard might say you have to have this, but the way you're accomplishing it is doing above and beyond what the standard is saying, and it's resulting in a secure state. Because ultimately, the security standards, such as PCI, they want to ensure that you are achieving a good state of being secure. They don't necessarily want to say that, you have this checkbox, and they don't want their standard to be diluted to that sort of thing. They want it to be a good way of ensuring security. All too often, though, some auditors that aren't, as quote-unquote good or less experienced, they look at, you have to see exactly what the standard says. And that can be troublesome, and it can be a bit of a challenge. So without further ado, we'll move on to fun with PCI. Everything in here is based on the DSS standard 3.2, effective of last April. And I have to insert my standard disclaimer about not being a lawyer here. What I would say, if there's any discrepancy, just like any QSA, consult your bank, because that's what they would say to do. But I'm going to look at this as a technologist, not necessarily an auditor or anything like that. So take that all with a grain of salt. I'm also going to have to apologize for all the text on the slides. I'm pretty sure that in 5 years of giving presentations, this one presentation has more text than any other presentation I've given combined, but the slides will be a good reference later. So requirement 1.1.7 in PCI, review your firewall and router rule sets every 6 months. So in order to comply with the letter of the law, you can generate a ticket every 6 months that says someone has to check the firewall rules. You don't have to necessarily do anything with that ticket, but if you show that there's a ticket that gets generated, you can say, hey, we have a ticket that says we have to do this. Obviously, that's not the greatest approach. So if you conduct and document reviews of your firewall rule sets regularly and remove rules that aren't being actively used, you are already doing the standard, and that's really what the intent of this compliance rule is to do. An even better approach, a best practice, continuously audit your firewall policies. There are tools that exist to be able to do this. So if a change is made, you can have someone review that as it happens and be able to say, this rule is a bad rule, we should fix it now. As opposed to, having that rule go in on the first day after you do your 180-day review, and then having basically a bad rule in there for months and months on end before it's picked up by a manual review. So, requirement 2.2.1, for wireless environments, change all vendor defaults in installation, with the emphasis on all, possibly added by me. But basically on the letter of the law, that's saying you got to change everything, regardless of if the default is a more secure option. Let's just say they have WPA2 Enterprise enabled by default. No, you got to change that to what? Because PCI says they need to change everything. Obviously, that's dumb. So from a spirit of the law perspective, change your insecure defaults and change it to the most secure alternative offered by the product. And in terms of your best practice, review your device configuration to determine the best configuration for the environment. Also restrict your management access. Everyone who's on the network shouldn't be able to access the management interfaces for devices. You shouldn't be able to get into the web interfaces for your wireless devices or anything else, so to speak. So restricting management access obviously makes it harder for anyone else to be able to get into the systems. This approach sort of makes sense so far? Any questions? And perfect. So I'm not insane. Requirement 5 deals with antivirus. And I know antivirus is one of those things that gets a lot of crap from people, rightfully so, because there are often better approaches. But PCI requires that you protect against all types of malicious software. And your antivirus program has to be capable of detecting, removing, and protecting against all forms of malicious software, which is not possible. So, the letter of the law, you're never going to be able to hit that, because there's no signature-based antivirus that has a 100% detection rate. However, if RFC 3514 was released, anyone know what that is? It's the evil bit. Basically, if a packet had the evil bit set to true, it would be dropped by all security devices, and anything that had the evil bit set as false would just be allowed through. So that was an April Fool's RFC, basically for making security easier, because you had set the evil bit, drop it. Obviously that doesn't work, and just logically it doesn't make any sense, but it would be amazing if everything just was that simple. But the spirit of the law, advanced antivirus that doesn't rely on signatures or scheduled scans can be actually more effective. And most of the next generation, so to speak, antiviruses, that's what it does. However, this really seems to indicate signature-based antivirus, whereas the technology is moving more towards non-signature or different types of more advanced antivirus that rely on other factors. So, that all said, if my thing will let me click. No. Technology is hard. There we go. Find an antivirus that provides reasonable detection rate, but also use other forms of protection. Layers of defense, just like that we were talking about earlier, that's the best way to achieve security. And don't rely on antivirus as going to be the end-all be-all, just because it's not. Now the next one deals with passwords. So passwords need to have 7 characters. They need to have alphanumeric and numeric characters, and change it every 90 days. So, letter of the law, auto-expire your passwords every 90 days. Make sure they're at least 7 characters. So let's think of some passwords that would be PCI compliant based on the standard. Password 1, that is PCI compliant based on this, because it's more than 7 characters and has a number in it. Is that a good password? No. How long would that take to get cracked by software? Longer than I talked about, or shorter than I talked about passwords. It would be instant. So obviously, just by having this, we're not secure, but we're compliant. And really, this is highlighting the spirit of this law to have a comprehensive secure password policy, prevent password reuse. And even better, the latest version in PCI 3.2 is emphasizing the use of two-factor authentication. So by having that second factor, it makes it difficult, even if the password is compromised, to be able to have someone actually use those credentials. Granted, it's not perfect, but it makes it way better than having your password 1, which is PCI compliant. 11.4, it deals with IPS and IDS, and it is looking to have you verify that there is configuration and that you have an IDS solution. And essentially, from a letter of the law perspective, it really, the thing that an assessor needs to do is check that an IDS exists and has some configuration. And this actually makes me kind of think of when I did more SOC type alerting things earlier in my career, where it seemed like every time that a company had an assessment, they would get, we get IDS alerts for like there being browser toolbars in the assessor's machine. And we're like, well, that's weird. Why are these auditors always having these browser toolbars that are causing these alerts? And it really didn't dawn on me until I was doing this research, like, maybe they were actually testing the fact that the IDS was working by having that. And it all kind of makes sense that, that's probably part of their assessment to ensure, like, let's have a machine that looks really nasty that's calling out to the internet, or a way to do this on our machines. Let's make sure that however this company is doing IDS, make sure that we see that from a obvious, like, make sure this is working perspective. So now that I think about it, they might have been onto something by doing that. I don't know if that was actually the intent, but generally that's what we found. But really, the test of your IDS should not be your audit. Working great. From a spirit of the law perspective, confirm your IDS alerts and make sure that it's working on a regular basis. Ensure that the results or the alerts, they are reviewed and that they're responded to. We can think of a notable example of where a major breach was happening that the company got an alert for, but nothing happened. One of the bigger breaches that happened in the past couple of years with a logo with a bullseye. That was exactly an example where they had the event to track what was happening, but just didn't do anything about it. And really, from a best practice perspective, for your IDS, test it. Make sure that it's working, and don't assume that your IPS is blocking stuff either. Trust but verify. And that's a overwhelming theme that I like to carry through everything we talk about security. Understand that you have technologies that are doing things, that you have vendors that are providing services, but make sure that whatever they claim to be doing is actually what's happening. And the trust but verify theme is really important for that. Now, requirement 9.1.2, it requires that you implement physical or logical controls for restricting access to your publicly accessible network jacks. So the way that you can do that is simply station an armed guard at every network jack to ensure that, nothing happens. And that would be a physical control to restrict the access. Obviously, that's ridiculous, and but it would be PCI compliant if you did that. From a spirit of the law, like, your publicly accessible jacks shouldn't be connected to anything in scope for PCI. So if you are at a supermarket, for example, that has the registers that are sending clear text credit card numbers over to the central server, which it used to happen more. Now it's much more common to have that encrypted on the credit card reader and be SSL sent over to the central server. So we have less of that being a concern. But even then, just walking down the aisles, there shouldn't just be network jacks that anyone could plug into. Granted, the network jacks connected to the registers in that case are definitely still publicly accessible because people can get to them. So in terms of not having anything connected to scope for PCI, we try to limit that scope, obviously, to the smallest possible, but we're still going to have some things that are going to be potentially at risk. From a best practice perspective, there's a couple ways I can think of handling that. Network level authentication being one, obviously not perfect, but this second one, alerting on the connection of unauthorized devices or failed authentication attempts, or having something where if a switch port goes down, it doesn't get re-enabled until someone calls about it or takes action on that. That can be a good way to prevent someone from just reaching behind a cash register and plugging in a device. Granted, it causes an additional administrative burden, but no one should be unplugging or disconnecting your cash registers ever. So if you look at something like that from a, how do we make sure that we prevent this from happening, you're causing yourself more work, but you're potentially eliminating a very easily accessible source of getting into your network. So it can be definitely one of those things that can help a lot. The next one I'm going to look at is vulnerability scans, 11.2. So this requirement says you need to run internal and external network scans on a regular basis. After any significant change, such as a new system component installation, changes in technology, firewall rule modifications being a specific change or significant change, How many people make firewall rule modifications relatively frequently, like daily basis? How many of you run internal and external network scans after every firewall change? Probably not. So quarterly is what we most commonly see. From a letter of the law perspective, you just need to run the scan. You don't need to do anything about it, but you can say, hey, we run this scan, we have the scan report. We never looked at the darn thing, but we have it. That said, there are additional requirements that touch on patching. So I don't want to say that PCI just says, hey, run network scans and don't worry about them. But if we just look at this, if I'm reading this documentation for PCI and they're like, hey, this is what we got to do, and you can get the checkbox for being compliant without actually being secure. But from a spirit of law perspective, having a vulnerability management program is really what this is trying to highlight. When you make a change to your environment or on a regular ongoing basis, we want to assess what vulnerabilities or potential security risks that it introduces into our environment. We want to know, like, hey, if we're deploying a new product, we probably have to change firewall rules, maybe make some network topology changes, and there might be some new system components that get added too. So we want to know that when we introduce a new product, how do we make the change? Or how do we make sure that that's not introducing more vulnerabilities into what we have? Also, from a spirit of the law perspective and the best practice, which I want to get to, if you have the ability to continuously monitor for vulnerabilities and use that vulnerability information in your SIM for seeing what things you are vulnerable to and saying, hey, I have an IDS alert that happened, and my SIM is saying that system is vulnerable to what the IDS alert triggered on, you're in a much more secure state. And you're also meeting the requirements for this aspect of PCI, but also your IDS component as well. So really, across the board, we look at these as guidelines as to what we want to achieve from a being secure perspective, and basically treat PCI as exactly what it is, a framework, and not necessarily the Bible as to every verse and line of what we need to do in order to be completely secure. Now, the last one I want to touch on is time synchronization technology. So this says, synchronize all of the critical clocks and making sure that it's consistent. This one hits home to me because of all the work I do with log management with Splunk. Obviously, when you're trying to correlate events across systems, if the timestamps don't match, it is a major pain. So making sure that time synchronization happens across the whole environment is critical in order to be able to track what happens in an environment. So in order to deploy this one-time synchronization technology, you could use as an intern. Have them set the clocks periodically. It's technology. It's not the best, but it would be compliant. Obviously, the spirit of this, NTP or something equivalent. If you need to use something that's more precise than NTP for your business, perfectly fine. But make sure it's functional across all your devices. I would say that this says all critical system clocks. I would say everything should be using NTP or have correct time, because you never know what information in your SIM you might need later in order to make sure that you're having consistent time. And dealing with time zones is also something you need to be very concerned about, because if you have some devices logging in UTC, some devices logging in Eastern Time, some devices logging in India time and a half, whatever they have in that time zone, I mean, it's hard enough for us to get calendar invites correctly when we look at that. And then if we're looking after the fact, trying to figure out a security incident and making sure that those all work out, obviously get it right up front so that when you're under the stress of dealing with something, you are able to handle that more effectively. But yeah, make sure NTP is part of your standard config. Monitor for time drift too. If something is more than whatever you accept as your standard of being in sync off, that's something that NTP might have got hung up and the time is drifting for whatever reason. You need to fix it. So that's a good thing to monitor on, especially if you're relying on your logs to be consistent across the board. And time zones. UTC is great if you want to keep everything the same. It's not as great if you want to actually know what time it is when you look at it, because you have to either do that conversion in your brain or use your sim to do that. But whatever you standardize in your organization, just keep it across the board. So now I want to share some lessons learned and also some compliance hacks, because we like talking about hacks at security conferences, even though I'm not really breaking into anything. But first pro tip, read the PCI DSS before they show up. Don't ask your auditor or your QSA for a cheat sheet on like, hey, what are you going to check me on? I talk to a bunch of QSAs and they say they get this question a lot. And it really, really, really turns them off when they get that, because they're like, oh, they don't know what they're doing. So it's kind of like showing up to the test in school and asking the teacher, you know, like, so what are we going to learn on this test? Not going to work out too well. I can say that I read through the whole PCI DSS on a flight from Cleveland to Atlanta, so it's not that bad. Granted, it's a great way to fall asleep. So if you can't fall asleep at night, grab any compliance standard, just start reading, you'll be out in no time. But it's definitely something that, you know, it's written in words, they're English, you can understand them. Some of it's a little dry, but it really does a good job, especially PCI, to break down, you know, what an assessor should be looking for and what the standard is. So granted, I pull out individual lines from that. There's a lot more to it in those 120 some pages. Don't treat your compliance project like a big project. Treat it like an ongoing goal. Treat it like, if you haven't ever had an assessment from a company perspective, you know, you might need to get to the point where it is a project to get there. But from that point forward, treat it like your way of life. Understand that, you know, a year down the road, you're going to be assessed on this again. So don't slack off. Don't consider it as something, oh, we don't need to worry about this for a year now. Consider it something that's an ongoing thing. Don't think that you get your compliance certificate and you don't have to do things anymore. Like log review is a component of PCI compliance. You don't want to be for the, you know, the 2 weeks where you're getting an audit, looking at your logs, and then going the next 50 weeks without doing that again. So it is one of those ongoing things. And compliance and security is a way of life. It's your way of corporate life, but it should be the culture of your organization that's subject to compliance. So as you ensure that you're taking steps to maintain security, you're also taking these steps to be compliant, because you're designing things around being secure and the compliance is naturally following. Because if you are secure, you will be, by definition, compliant, because that's how the compliance standards are set up. However, if you just focus on being compliant, it definitely doesn't mean that you're going to be secure, because the letter of the law doesn't give you everything you need to be secure. And fundamentally, this is the last one that I got from talking to a number of QSAs, but be nice to your QSA. They have a lot of discretion in determining whether or not you're going to pass an audit or not, whether or not they are going to say that to your face. Part of the reason why I can't give any names as credit for this presentation is because no one wants to admit to this. But every single QSA that I talked to said that if a client they show up to is being a jerk to them, or, you know, starts off in a defensive tone, they're going to look at things a little bit more differently than someone who's more cooperative. It is human nature. Unfortunately, we are working with people in this regard. So I want to say that everyone that I talked to said that. It's, you know, maybe a secret, but keep that in mind. You know, we're all people. We have a common goal for this. Treat each other with respect. Ask for help, and, you know, be able to support what you're doing from a perspective of, you want to end up with a common goal where you're going to be compliant, they're going to be able to complete the audit without a lot of problems, and ultimately things will work out pretty well. And one of the quotes that came out of this is, implementing compliance is a job, implementing security is a career. Be the person who implements their career in security, and don't just look at it as another job you need to do. And don't think that if you just get compliance, you don't have to worry about security, because that's not how it works. Then from an acknowledgements perspective, we had several anonymous former and current QSAs, people who were recovering QSAs and actual QSAs who supported this research. I know this sounds like, because I'm not identifying anyone in particular, but they were very, very helpful for helping myself and Steve on my team to understand what goes into an audit. And it has helped me, at least, to be able to talk with clients a lot more intelligently about what they're concerned about when we go through a PCI compliance exercise. There were also a lot of security admins. Some are Hurricane Labs clients, some are not, that are subject to this compliance. And we went through with a lot of detail as to what goes through your mind when you go through an audit. How do you make sure that you are secure? What are things you're concerned about? What are surprises that you've had as you're doing this? And a lot of that played into building this talking to them. So that was incredibly helpful. And also other anonymous people that we're not going to talk about, and not the anonymous with the guys with masks. So with that, I'd like to open the floor for questions. And this is another quote from an anonymous QSA. It's PCI. There are no easy questions. So anyone have any questions? Okay. Well, hopefully I don't see anyone snoring, so that's always a good sign. But thank you so much for having the opportunity to have me here, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.